Now, yes, and we can...
Yes, you can
Okay.
open.
Yeah.
Open.
So, my name is Monica Lemos. I am a doctoral student here at Cradle, and we are now interviewing Professor Yrjo Engestrom. The main issue is about Cradle and the history of Cradle and some basic foundations of activity theory.
All right.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. We can edit some things
Do you
if it's necessary.
do you want to ask me questions, or how do we proceed?
I think you could start talking
Okay.
about Cradle.
Cradle first,
How
yeah.
the history of Cradle and how it's organized nowadays, and then we can
Yeah.
maybe
Sure. Yeah.
some dialogue.
Okay. Yeah. I think it would be good if you have further questions or comments. Then
Okay.
when I go along, you can interrupt. And
Okay.
yeah, Cradle. The whole name is the Center for Research on Activity, Development and Learning, and it's a research center within the Institute of Behavioral Sciences here at the University of Helsinki. And as a research center, we are very much dependent on grants, various research projects which receive outside funding, and we also run a doctoral program. Monica is in this doctoral program yourself, and a master's program. So we are part of a bigger department, but relatively independent, because we also not only do research, but we also have our own training programs, our own educational programs. The Cradle was founded in 1994, so we are almost 20 years old. Well, let's say we're 18 years old. And the initial name was Center for Activity Theory and Developmental Work Research. A few years ago we changed the name, partly because we merged with another research unit here in our department. It was a research unit led by Professor Kai Hakkarainen, which was focused on network learning. But their theoretical approach was becoming very close to ours, so we joined, and some of our current researchers have come from that merger. And also the original name of our center was a little bit difficult to remember and complicated. So this Cradle is quite easy. The acronym Cradle is also quite appropriate because it refers to, you know, a place where a baby can sleep and grow. And we feel that our own ideas and our own approach are something which is still quite young and perhaps even in infancy, and needs a lot of nurturing, and at the same time we also would like to serve as a cradle for young researchers such as you, Monica, and others who come here to study and work with us. And it has served as such quite well. We have over 30 PhDs who have graduated from our doctoral program over the years, and this means that we have probably been quite successful in educating new researchers who base their work on activity theory.
So then maybe you could talk a little bit about Cradle's theoretical approach,
Yeah.
and also describe a little bit the relation between the theory and the projects you develop in Cradle.
Yeah. The cultural historical activity theory is our foundational framework, and of course this is a broad theoretical approach in which there are different variations. In Brazil, I know that, for instance, the work of Yrjo and his colleagues from Paris, France, has been quite influential, and he is a good collaboration partner. His approach to activity theory is slightly different, perhaps a bit more psychological, and whereas we like to also emphasize a lot the sort of collective and organizational aspects of the activity. The cultural historical activity theory, as we see it, is not only a psychological theory. It is an interdisciplinary approach that is relevant for all human and social sciences. And we have here in our center people who come from very diverse scientific backgrounds, ranging from philosophy and psychology all the way to engineering and economics and sociology and even medicine. So this broad range of scientific disciplines testifies to the usefulness and potential of activity theory across disciplines. And in order to pursue that type of approach, which is very interdisciplinary, we have to have a very strong theoretical conceptual framework. And our version of activity theory is built very much around the concepts of object-oriented activity systems, which are collective and which have a long-term durability, so that these activity systems are often organized, they take shape as organizations. Of course, not only formal organizations, also informal organizations such as communities and families are relevant for us. But we are interested in this relatively longitudinal processes of change and transformation and development and learning in these collective activity systems, which can be modeled and analyzed with the help of some foundational models, such as the quite well-known triangular models of activity which we use. Some people associate us with only those triangles, and I think that's a very narrow view of our work. They are useful models because they are tools, they are conceptual tools, they're to be used and tested and changed and modified, and like any tool, they are not in any way the sort of canonical fixed let's say a theory of ours. They are tools to develop the theory and make the theory work also in practice.
Or rigid, as many people
Many
discuss.
people see them as rigid, perhaps because people also feel that diagrams themselves are somehow static. Well, of course, the question is how you use the diagrams, how you make them alive, how you develop and change and fill them with contents and put them in particular reality contexts. So, but they are important for us because in itself this complex triangular model was quite a demanding accomplishment as such, because the founders of activity theory, Vygotsky and Leontiev and others, never did that kind of modeling. They used some very simple models to indicate the mediational structure of the action, you know, subject, object and mediating artifact or mediating sign. But the collective aspect of activity, which comes from fact that the activities are carried by communities and that these communities have divisional labor and also rules. And all these elements have to come together and they are in interplay, constantly influencing one another. This kind of modeling has been very important for us. And we nowadays work a lot with what we call third generation activity theory, which implies that we're not only looking at the single activity system, but the interplay between multiple activity systems, which somehow are focused on partially the same object. For instance, let's say in the field of healthcare, there may be different healthcare providers who treat the same patients and have to somehow find each other, create some forms of collaborative relations between each other. Or we study networks of organizations and various such multi-activity combinations. But that's of course the third generation activity theory, as we call it, is not the only thing we do. We also go increasingly into the let's say the dynamics of the subject, the subjectivity involved in activity. Issues such as how is agency and motivation formed, how do people become committed, and how can they go beyond the existing circumstances, what this means for their processes of experiencing, and in that sense, at the same time as we have expanded the unit of analysis to include multiple activity systems, we have also tried to go deeper into the aspect of the subject.
So the journal we are sending the interview, it's called Interface, Health, Education and Communication.
Mm-hmm.
How would you connect the third generation of activity theory in the research area to these three thematic areas?
Health, education
and communication.
And communication. Well, it's quite interesting that in our center, in the cradle, especially health and education have both been very central research areas. In healthcare organizations, we have a long tradition. Actually, my own work in healthcare organizations started already before the cradle existed in the 1980s, and some of the healthcare organizations here in Finland, such as the Health Center of the city of Helsinki, are very long-term partners in our research, so that we have carried on multiple projects and there is a continuity of collaboration. And some of their experts who work in those organizations have received their PhDs or have been trained by us, so that there is a kind of an organic interaction. At the moment, for instance, in Helsinki, we're studying the home care of the old people in the city of Helsinki, which is an increasingly important issue here in Finland, because the population is becoming older very rapidly, and the care of the old people who are sick, but not so sick that they cannot, that they are not completely dependent on institutional care. So how to provide for forms of care where they can remain relatively independent, relatively autonomous, and how to support that independence are very important issues at the moment here. And we also have an ongoing relationship with the major university hospital here in Finland, in the north, Oulu University Hospital. So healthcare field is for us very important because at least in Finland we still have mostly public health care. That means that it is not only private business, but the society, the public sector is the key organizer of healthcare, and this allows usually more possibilities for let's say analysis and intervention and change efforts, because if it's only run by the logic of profit, it is, we find it more difficult to find space for serious development efforts. Often simply because the activity is so, you know, tightly connected to relatively short-term profits. The similar thing applies to education. We traditionally have had a number of educational institutions which we have studied, which are trying to transform themselves, ranging from kindergartens to universities. And at the moment, as you know, Monica, in our doctoral program we have 5 doctoral students in our current class of 2012 who all study educational change processes in different countries. If anything, I'm a little bit envious because all of you come from different countries but not from Finland, and we would need badly a project about the Finnish educational change. Of course, people can say that Finland is rather well off because our educational system has been quite successful in the international PISA comparisons, but still I would say that we're facing also very major transformations in education. They have to do with, for instance, the issue of how the schools can open up to the society and how they can motivate young people rather than just make, you know, at the moment Finnish schools are quite good in academic achievement, but the motivational aspect is not that strong. But in any case, I would see that health and education are very strong streams of our empirical research and our intervention work, in which we facilitate change efforts in health and educational organizations, typically at the level of local organizations, but also increasingly at the level of regional networks such as the Helsinki healthcare organizations, how they can work together, and perhaps in the future also at the level of let's say the nationwide institutions. One of our senior colleagues, Professor Yrjo Engestrom, has just finished a book in which he discusses the why Finnish school system has been relatively successful, and he focuses much on the special education field in Finland, and tries to understand it as a sort of a nationwide movement to help children and families who are having learning difficulties. And this type of sort of nationwide movement or institution building is perhaps another level which goes beyond even regional networks. And I think that both in healthcare and in education, we need to take into account the very local, but also the regional and the nationwide.
Maybe something that you have said before elsewhere about the fact that people want to buy educational systems, Finnish educational systems.
Yeah, that's true. There is a something of a rather naive idea let's imitate those who are successful. And there's been a lot of, let's say, educational experts and educational decision makers who have come to Finland to see what they could adopt from the Finnish educational system. I don't think that such an effort is very useful if you simply try to transplant some solutions that we have here. The cultural conditions in each country and each culture are so specific that you have to, at least from the point of view of activity theory, you have to dig into the history and the historical contradictions and possibilities in the given culture. And of course then at some point it's useful to make comparisons also and maybe find best practices elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that you can transplant them directly. That's, for instance, the very fact that we happen to be a Protestant country means that, and we have been quite monocultural. You know, traditionally Finns have been relatively isolated. So we have a very monocultural society still, only now changing to becoming multicultural. And even the religious background has been for nearly 500 years relatively singular, so that this Lutheran Protestant religion has actually facilitated literacy, because you know, the Protestant church emerged so that it emphasized that everybody should have their personal relationship to Bible. Therefore they had to learn to read and write. So this particular historical fact explains a lot about why literacy is at the high level in Finland, because you know, the church, before there was any school system actually, the church required certain literacy from people. So these are particular historical conditions which are different in every country and every culture. And I think what we need is multicultural comparisons and maybe hybridizations, but not just export-import.
Okay. Yeah, because somehow here in Cradle there are many people from different countries that come to investigate or to be part or to study more about the activity theory in health system and the whole development for over these years in the health system and the projects you developed there.
That's true, but I think their interest is in the theory and methodology, not so much in the specific solutions, because the specific solutions cannot be easily copied. But you mentioned also communication, and the field of communication, I think that we can look at it from two points of view. On one hand, we have also a series of intervention studies in organizations which are in the field of mass communication, in particular newspapers, broadcast organizations. So that's one area where we have had projects with the major newspapers, major broadcasting companies, and also telecommunications companies. But then on the other hand, the whole issue of communication is of course also a sort of a theoretical question. How we see communication as part of the activity. What is the relationship between communication and activity? And you know, there are theoretical approaches which separate them quite radically. For instance, Jürgen Habermas and his critical theory of communicative action almost puts practical activity and communication against each other, and say that the domain of communication is the sort of domain where you can be free of power constraints and hierarchies and really find an exchange on the basis of equality, etc. And then the domain of practical activity is always burdened by power and hierarchy and such constraints. I think that this kind of dualistic notions are deeply wrong, I think that all practical activities are inherently communicative activities. You cannot do medicine without communicating. You cannot even build a house without communicating. And the same way, you cannot only communicate. Much of our communication actually happens by means of practical action. We are just now studying a very interesting site. A group of people building traditional fishing boats, large fishing boats in the Bay of Bengal in India. And when they build these large boats, they hardly speak to each other because they communicate with their bodies, with their practical actions. Everybody is tuned to each other and to the whole by means of actually seeing the boat. And the boat itself is a communicative device, but also, of course, a very practical product. It's the object that they're building, but it actually mediates also communication between them, so that the builders can be in perfect coordination without speaking much and without writing anything. Most of them are actually illiterate. So this is an example that communication pervades all practical action, and they cannot be separated. I think it's a hopeless idea to separate the domain of communication from the domain of practical activity. This means, of course, that we also have to study a lot of discourse, various forms of using language in practical activities, but not reduce activities to only discourse.
Do you think we can connect that to the principle of multi-voicedness?
Certainly, yes. Any activity is foundationally multi-voiced. You cannot reduce an activity to a single perspective, to a single subject, because activities are collective formations, and this means that no individual, no participant, no subject shares exactly the same view, the same perspective, the same interests with the others. And this multi-voicedness is a tremendous source of potential novelty, innovation, richness, and also resilience in activity systems. When we look at activity systems which become too monotonous, they are also vulnerable. It's harder for them to find resources when there's trouble. On the other hand, if we have a very, very diverse activity system where the different participants don't understand each other, then we have fragmentation. So we are one dimension to look at activity systems and their change is to look at issues of fragmentation versus total unification. You move in this dimension all the time. Many people who think that the only way to manage organizations is to make them completely under control, in a sense totally predictable. Many people like that think that excessive diversity must be eliminated, but of course diversity is something which, when you orchestrate it, when people find ways to play together, it's a tremendous source of energy and richness. So these are certainly at the core of our research. And for instance, in medicine, just looking at any clinic where you have multiple doctors and talking to these doctors, investigating how they see the patient, you usually see multiple different models of the patient, multiple different ways to conceptualize the object. Some take the classical biomedical view, some take a more socio-medical view, some take a more psychotherapeutic view. And if these can play together somehow, they're of course stronger.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the change laboratory? Yes,
our version of activity theory is inherently interventionist. We see that in the history of activity theory, already Vygotsky and his followers, Leontiev, Luria, Davidov and others, they were also doing interventions. Their research was based on the idea that you can actually find potentials and possibilities by intervening, by creating new challenges and new settings in which people can sort of step to the next level or next zone of proximal development of their own activity. And for that you need interventions. I think that the intervention methodologies that our Soviet and Russian colleagues developed remained a little bit, they were not fully articulated. They never formulated these methodologies very, very fully. So it's the task of our generations to make these methodologies more systematic, explicit, and also, you know, make them responsive to today's needs. And there are the multiple intervention methodologies that activity theoretical researchers are using. I mentioned Yves Clos and his research group. They use what they call the clinic of activity, and we have developed particularly this change laboratory method. The change laboratory itself is actually, the idea is that when a collective, let's say it's an organization or unit of an organization, perhaps a community, are are facing an important transformation, some change which is not easy to master, in which they need to somehow create their own vision and their own agency to direct their own development. Then bringing in those people, or at least a representative group of these people, into a series of sessions. Often we have about 10 sessions with roughly once a week or every 2 weeks, where we sit down and start by presenting what we call mirror material, namely material which is often videotaped, but also other kinds of materials, statistics, interviews, etc., in which demonstrate things that create problems and trouble, breakdowns, disturbances, sometimes even crises in the organization, in the activity.
And who makes part of this?
Usually it's us researchers who collect the data, but when we have a long-term partnership, we often can rely on the local participants, the practitioners themselves, to collect this data. But if we enter a new activity system, we often have to do it ourselves. And that may take several months to collect this kind of background data and to also dig into the history of this particular activity. And then in these change laboratory sessions, we present selected examples of that kind of data, that kind of evidence, and ask them to tell what they see in it and why is this happening. What is happening and why. And this often creates a very strong, what we call, first a critical conflict and perhaps even a double bind situation where people feel that something must be done to change this, but we don't know what. And from this kind of strong motivational commitment, which is often also quite conflictual because people also, they would like to deny it. So there's, you need to work on it enough so that the involvement becomes a serious engagement and commitment to change. And then, you know, from that we move to the history to ask, okay, where did this trouble start? When did this happen? What are the roots? And already there we start using these models, for instance, the triangular models of the activity, but also other tools such as historical timelines to identify cycles of change in the history of the given activity. And so it's not anymore just sort of emotional engagement with things that go wrong, but then it becomes also intellectual distanced analysis. Mm-hmm. And you have to move between this personal emotional engagement and a little more detached analytical kind of conceptual work. And this movement is very, very crucial. Through the historical analysis, which often, we like to build it so that people bring their own personal histories into it too. When did I come to this activity? When did I start this work? And so, what happened then? How was it different then? How is it now? And through this history, they build kind of hypotheses of what are the structural systemic contradictions behind these problems, and that leads then to the efforts to model the future. And the future modeling, there you also may use comparisons with other similar activities elsewhere to get kind of impulses and ideas, and just to play with the future possibilities to sort of construct a vision for your own zone of proximal development. And then this leads to that we typically decide together with the practitioners that certain aspects of this future model can be implemented now, right now, here and now, in the next few months. And let's see what you can do with them. In other words, they select kind of sub-projects which they then test in practice. And we follow up on that and gradually, because you can never just implement a whole new model like this overnight and change everything right now. You have to sort of build this change into the existing activity and gradually transform it. And this is, of course, the implementation phase can be very, very demanding. So we try to follow that up and support that also with the follow-up meetings of the Change Laboratory. This whole process is a kind of condensed and pressurized process of expansive learning, as we call it. So, the actual Change Laboratory sessions may be run in